We're going to talk about Genshin stinginess now that the dust has settled down, to explain a little bit, kind of like economics and management possible reasons. I'm not going to say it's the only reason why Genshin is as stingy as it is, and why it makes sense for them to do that, at least for now. So what you gotta understand is two concepts that I will use. These are very, very basic, fundamental business and economics concepts. Some of you probably already know about these, but we're gonna be applying them to theorize why Genshin is managed the way that it currently is. So we're gonna look at two things. We're gonna look at Porter, and we're gonna look at competition. So these are the two concepts that we're going to be looking at for why Genshin behaves the way it behaves. The first thing is Porter. So we're going to look at Porter 5 forces, which is a very basic concept in business. So the thing that we need to look at is the Porter 5 forces. We're going to look at two of them. We're going to look at the threat of substitution and the threat of new entrants. These are two quite important that will also feed into the competition aspect of it. The threat of substitutes is there in the market for your product something that will replace you easily if you don't compete properly with your opposition? And the other threat is the threat of new entrants. Does your market have high barriers or low barriers to entry so that your product gets substituted very easily? Does Genshin have a threat of substitution at the moment? Not really. The only thing you could technically substitute it with would be something like Tower of Fantasy within the gacha market, but this is more of an MMO. So it's not a very one-to-one substitute. So that's something that just does not really exist for them. So they're pretty peaceful in that regard. Threats of new entry is another one that for a long time they did not need to worry about. Why? Because a game of the size of Genshin Impact or of the style requires a lot of money, a lot of very big investments. And this is something that we call a barrier to entry. One of the reasons why you have very little competition for pharmaceutical companies, for example, it's because there is a very high barrier to entry. Getting those patents, getting those, for example, like the patents for medications, the research, the technology to research further and further, costs a pretty penny, so they don't need to deal with this threat of entry. The threat of substitutes for pharmaceutical companies does exist, but it's a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to go into that. But from a business and finance point of view, this is what we would call a barrier to entry. So these two things are something that for years Genshin has not had to worry about. Now, when we talk about competition, there are multiple types of competition. There are like there are a few types of competition. We have perfect competition, we have monopolistic competition, and we have a monopoly, right? Well, there are some more, but I'm not going to go into these because these are the main ones to keep in mind at the moment. Perfect competition, you have low barriers to entry, you have ease of substitute, and a few other things. Basically, it's a very competitive market where it's very good for the consumers because they can find substitutes very easily. Monopolistic competitions are very similar to monopolies. So monopolies, oh yeah, you also have oligopolies, right? This will become an issue later on, by the way. So these are the type of compositions to keep in mind. So monopolies are very simple. You have one singular that provides the service, right? So if you have only one singular company or one single entity that controls an entire market, that's what we call a monopoly. That is really bad for consumers because if that's the only option that you have to buy a service, then you're fucked because they can do whatever they want. They can do whatever the fuck they want. Oligopolies is very close to a monopoly, but it's very few companies control the entire market. So think, for example, electricity. Think, for example, internet service providers. In some countries, think, for example, the car market. Those are very common examples of oligopolies, where very few control the entire market. Now, the one that I want to talk the most about is monopolistic competition, because this is a type of competition. Let me just... monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition means that the products that are It's a competition, so it's kind of very similar to Perfect Competition, but there is differentiation. I cannot type for shit. There is differentiation. So the differentiation factor is what allows them to have something similar to a monopoly. Now, one of the common examples for monopolistic competition is, for example, the burger industry. So McDonald's is different from Burger King. Even though they're competing in the same, they are competing with each other. AMD is competing with NVIDIA and so on. You can substitute them, but it's not the same product, it's not the same things that they provide. Generally speaking, monopolistic competition is not that big of an issue. So Genshin can be categorized as monopolistic competition because they have differentiation, but they're still gacha games. So they're still within the gacha within the gacha segment. So if you don't want to play Genshin, but you still want to play gacha games, you can play other things like Nikkei, you can play other things. There are other options. It's not a true monopoly. What gets really tricky, though, is that in a monopolistic competition, depending on how severe the differentiation factor is, the monopolistic effect that it has on the consumers becomes more and more severe. So, for example, if you think about how many gacha games that are Breath of the Wild style, open world gacha games, right? That are like massive single player with a little bit of multiplayer with co-op, RPGs that are kind of Breath of the Wild style. Well, the only one is really Genshin Impact, right? Genshin is literally the only one. Right? Genshin is literally the only one at the moment on the market. So you have high barriers to entry. You have a very close to monopoly. Right? You have a close to monopoly. You have high barriers to entry because it's very expensive to create one of these games. And within the gacha market, they're basically the only ones, right? And the threat of substitutes, right, is just not there because they're the only ones of that specific style within the market. So what does this mean? It means that they can take monopolistic practices almost as much as they want. They can take these monopolistic practices, and they know it. They absolutely know it. They absolutely know it. They know they can take these monopolistic practices because who else are you gonna go for this type of specific service, right? All of the gacha crowd that likes this Breath of the Wild RPG games, where are you gonna go else for that, right? There is no real substitution here. So they know this, and they know that they can get away with being as stingy as they want because they're the only real possibility here. Again, monopolistic competition with a very high barrier to entry, no real substitute. They can do whatever they want. So you have this situation where you have this singular entity. Now, they can get away with being as stingy as they want. 3 years, 3 wishes. What is the player base going to do about it? Let's be real here for a second. And that is something that is going to piss a lot of people off because that's the kind of like economics and management of it, is that they know they can get away with it. So they're trying to get as much as possible without any real consequences. Now, what's going to be interesting, though, is when games that are actual competitions in their direct segment are going to enter there. So when you have Wuthering Waves, what was the name of Azure Promelia, I think it was called? I'm just going to put Azure. You have Wuthering Waves, you have Azure, and whether other games that will come in the future that actually enter the market and that are genuine threats of substitutions. When this happens, they will actually start to compete for real. By Bummy Hoyo's office. Damn. So you have these genuine threats hopefully they don't bomb. Hopefully they do well, because if they do well, they will be genuine threats. Once they become genuine threats, well, you have substitutions. If the player base gets fed up, right? Well, they'll just substitute and just go to one of these. And MiHoYo is not stupid. They don't want this to happen. They absolutely do not want this to happen. So they will be forced to some extent to be less and less stingy because they cannot get away with it. By the way, the 3 years, 3 wishes thing, some people theorize that that it was a tactic so that they can increase it to like 10 or 20 and the player base would feel that they won, right? And if the player base didn't react, they would be just happy giving this away. I don't know how real that is, but it is a genuine business practice to lowball somebody so that they have something called the anchoring effect. So that they think that, well, this is low. Well, if they give something less low, because of the anchoring effect, they will think that this is good. Because they will have still this idea of the lowball in their minds, whether they want to or not. Yeah, 3-year 3-byte bombs. You're generating currency out of nothing. It does cost them in the sense that the currency that they generate, giving away free wishes, means that there is a chance that people wouldn't buy them because they got some for free. So by not giving away free wishes, the expectation would be that people would buy them. Now, you don't want to piss off your player base too much because even if there is no threat of substitution, even if there is no threat of new entrants in the horizon, if you piss them off too much, they're just not going to bother engaging with the product in the first place. So they still need to give some sense of, we care about you. Corporations don't care about you. They care about the bottom line. It costs an intern salary. That's a good way of putting it. So that is why I don't think that no matter how much the player base, in Genshin Impact, or in any future game that finds itself in a similar situation, kicks a fuss, as long as the casual, right? The casual, broader player base, which represents like freaking, 80% of the player base, maybe more, who knows? The casual player base, as long as they're still, somewhat content, doesn't matter. They're still good to go. Because also the hardcore ones, quite a few of them have something called sunk cost fallacy. So it doesn't even matter for them in many regards. So as long as there is not this threat of substitution in terms of economics, of substitution and new entrants, they have no real reason to do anything to change. Right? They have absolutely no reason to really change much. They will still change a little bit. They'll still try to make a good product to keep the people engaged. But they have no real incentive to be less stingy. Even if you review bomb whatever application, Honkai Star Rail or whatever it is, there is no real reason for them to change economically speaking, right? There is no real reason to until you have this threat, because what are you going to do? And that is the reason why Genshin is not changing anytime soon until you have this happening. Because at the moment, they're engaging in a monopolistic competition. Now, monopolistic competition can be a good thing because, as I established, clothing brands, restaurants, all of that is monopolistic competition. You don't go to a certain restaurant because you prefer a different restaurant. You go to Five Guys because you prefer it over McDonald's. You go to, you go buy Uniqlo because you prefer it over whatever other clothing brand there is. I'm not very well versed in brands. That's monopolistic competition. And generally speaking, it's not a big issue. except when you have severe cases like these, like Genshin Impact, where it approaches a true monopoly in every sense of the word. Because there is no close enough substitute that you can actually consider it a competition. Now, the other thing that is very funny, though, now, here is a different type of issue. And this is economics again. We only have 3, assuming that they all go and they don't bomb, right? You have 1, you have 2, you have 3. This is what we call an oligopoly. This is bad. This is really bad. So, oligopolies are when there are very few that control the market. This is bad in many ways. So, you may have experienced this with internet service providers or with car industries. Having very few people controlling the entire market is an issue. Also, Big Pharma is one of those too. It's a very big problem because of something that we call cartels. This is technically illegal, but it's very difficult to prove. And they can do something similar that approximates to a cartel by doing something that is like in quote unquote industry standard, right? Right. So cartel, what is a cartel? I'm not talking about drug lords here. Cartels are when an oligopolistic competition is happening between a few parties. So, for example, let's say Azure Promelia, Wuthering Waves, and Genshin, right? Well, they can just say there's only 3 disparage internet providers over here. Exactly, Lenny. So you know what I'm talking about when I say that. How's it going, my man? So, what would happen with cartels is that you have Azure Promelia, you have Wuthering Waves, and you have Genshin Impact. They say, we're the only 3 that control the entire market in this regard. Let's just make an agreement between all of us that we're going to do price fixing and we're going to do other anti-competitive things. Anti-competitive, and anti-consumer. Okay, so this is what happens with cartels. You have like these few that control the entire market, and they can raise the barriers to entry. They can fix the prices, as I said, and do another myriad of things that are anti-competitive and anti-consumer. Why? Because if they all behave the same and they all stay in their lane, controlling, their pieces of the market, they share the pie and they maximize the profits for themselves. Yes, indeed, price fixing, for example. So the reason why I say that they can do this directly or indirectly, because cartels are illegal. It is, anti-consumer and anti-competitive practices. It is banned by law, but the potential upside gain is so large that even if they get caught, they're still getting paid for breaking the law because the profits are so large and the fines that they can get are often not to the extent of the profits that they do, that we have this joke in economics about being paid to break the law. So let's imagine you have a parking spot and it costs you $10 to park there. But parking illegally, if you park illegally there, you're fined $5. This is what I call the concept, or we joke in economics in general, the concept of you're getting paid for breaking the law. Why? Because the fine is lower than the price of doing so. So I'm coming out at a net positive of $5. And that is something that happens in the real world quite often, actually. You have certain companies doing very illegal stuff, but the fine is so low that they're literally getting paid to break the law. And that is why a lot of cartels will still happen. Now, you have some concepts of prisoner's dilemma and other stuff that can cause it to break up naturally, right? The prisoner dilemma, in a very small nutshell, is can you trust your competition to uphold their end of the bargain and not try to go for something that will benefit at your expense? In a very, very short nutshell. But generally speaking, that is one concern of mine, is that while in theory the entrance of Azure Promelia and Wuthering Waves could promote competition with Genshin, meaning that it would be better for the consumer, quote-unquote forcing generosity out of Genshin Impact, they could just, do something like industry standard bullshit, where they all do similar types of gacha, similar types of pricing and similar types of practices, whether they agree to it or not, it will, in essence, be creating something like a cartel. And it's incredibly difficult to prove. So, unfortunately, this is the other risk that would make so that games like Genshin Impact will just never change in terms of stinginess. Cost of operations and everything, let's be real, they earn quite a bit of money. So that has never been a real issue for them. Why is HSR less stingy? It's not because it's their darling child. Where is Honkai Impact the Third less stingy? It's not because it's their darling or there's preferential treatment or the whole Genshin could never meme. The reality is that these face a much bigger threat of new entrants and substitution than Genshin has ever had in its 3 years of running on a daily basis. This is the reality. If you take Honkai Impact, well, there's Punishing Grey Raven. There is Aether Gazer. And there's probably a myriad of other similar games. There's probably going to be like Duet Abyss soon as well or something. I don't remember if Duet Abyss is open world or not. And there's like probably a myriad of other games that I'm forgetting about that threaten Honkai Impact 3. Honkai Star Rail, turn-based RPG gacha game. Honestly, not nearly as difficult to do compared to things like Genshin Impact. The barriers to entry are so much lower that they cannot afford to have this leeway compared to Genshin Impact. Isn't solo leveling a new ARPG? Yeah, solo leveling, right, that's true. Solo leveling. Right? And there is also like Danmachi and there's like a bunch of other ones. I'm just like saying examples. It's way easier to create, yes. And because it's easier and less expensive to create, it means that the barrier to entry is lower. That is the key thing.